On November 28th, 2025, President Trump announced he would pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez, JOH, a former Honduran president convicted in U.S. federal court of trafficking over 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. That same week, he declared Venezuelan airspace closed, claiming authority he doesn't have over another nation's sovereignty. Over 80 people have been killed in U.S. military strikes on boats. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth allegedly ordered personnel to kill everybody, including survivors clinging to wreckage in the water. As Hondurans went to the polls this weekend, Trump threatened to cut off all U.S. funding if they didn't vote for his chosen candidate, what Honduran experts are calling outright blackmail and vengeance against the entire nation. So here's the question. Is this about stopping drugs? Or is this the war on terror repackaged for Latin America, complete with extrajudicial killings, election interference, and oil interests disguised as moral crusades? Welcome back to Borderline Debates. I'm Maestro Morales, and this is episode 4, The Pardon Paradox. Today's episode comes with breaking developments. This morning on Democracy Now!, legal experts, historians, and national security journalists laid out the starkest assessment yet. What we're witnessing isn't just policy contradiction. It's what reporter Spencer Ackerman calls moral degeneracy, the transformation of the U.S. military into what functions as a criminal operation abroad. We're going to dissect every logical fallacy, every factual distortion, and every manufactured justification. And we're going to trace the through line from the post-9/11 war on terror to what's happening right now in the Caribbean and Central America. Because this isn't new, it's a pattern, and if we don't recognize it, we're condemned to repeat it. So let's get to work. Let's establish what we actually know, the documented, verifiable facts. Fact number 1, Juan Orlando Hernandez was convicted in U.S. federal court in March 2024 of conspiring to import more than 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. The evidence was, in the words of legal analysts, impeccable and overwhelming. Prosecutors showed how Hernandez used the Honduran National Police as personal enforcers for drug trafficking operations. Witnesses testified he was running Honduras as a narco state. He was sentenced to 45 years. On November 28th, Trump announced via social media he would pardon him, saying Hernandez had been treated very harshly and unfairly. Fact number 2. Since September 2025, the United States military has conducted over 20 strikes on boats in the Caribbean and Pacific, killing at least 83 people. The public justification? Alleged drug trafficking. The specific evidence for each boat? None has been provided to Congress, international observers, or the public. Fact number 3. The Washington Post reported, citing 2 sources with direct knowledge, that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered military personnel to, quote, kill everybody, unquote, on the first boat strike. When 2 survivors clung to wreckage, a second strike was ordered. The Pentagon calls this completely false. Hegseth calls it fake news, but has not explicitly denied giving the order. The Post stands by its reporting. Fact number 4. National security reporter Spencer Ackerman described these actions as moral degeneracy and argued the military is being turned into a criminal operation abroad, an extension of the post-9/11's war on terror's logic of impunity now applied to Latin America. Fact number 5. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated these strikes find no justification in international law. Democracy Now! Guests discussed the possibility of international war crimes investigations targeting Hegseth and others involved in ordering these strikes. Fact number 6. Trump has invoked fentanyl repeatedly to justify these operations, claiming boats are, quote, stacked with fentanyl. However, the New York Times confirmed Venezuela plays essentially no role in the production or smuggling of fentanyl. Military officials privately acknowledged the boats carried cocaine, not fentanyl. Nearly all fentanyl enters the U.S. through Mexico via legal ports of entry. Fact number 7. Venezuela is a documented transit point for Colombian cocaine to the US and Europe. UN data shows Venezuela accounted for roughly 10% of US destined cocaine and about half of European cocaine shipments between 2006 and 2008. Fact number 8. This weekend, as Hondurans voted in presidential elections, Trump explicitly threatened to cut off all US funding, humanitarian aid, security assistance, migration support if his preferred conservative candidate lost. Honduran opposition figures and historians call this a blackmail and vengeance against all Hondurans. Fact number 9. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, even more than Saudi Arabia. Despite calling Maduro a narco dictator, the Trump administration has granted Chevron and Shell operating licenses for Venezuelan oil fields. The New York Times reported Maduro's government offered to allocate Venezuelans' oil wealth to the U.S. to avoid strikes. Fact number 10. Honduran experts on Democracy Now! Noted that U.S. support for corrupt leaders like Hernandez spans multiple administrations, not just Trump, undermining the moral authority of any intervention claims. Those are the facts. Now let's talk about what they mean. Segment 2. Throwing justice out the window. Let me read you a quote from this morning's Democracy Now! Quote, years of evidence and legal work thrown out the window on social media, unquote. This is how one expert described Trump's announcement of the Hernandez pardon, and it's the perfect summary of what's happening here. Think about what went into Hernandez's conviction. Years of investigation, international cooperation, witness protection for people who risked their lives to testify, prosecutors building an airtight case, a jury hearing evidence, a judge issuing a sentence proportional to the crime, 400 tons of cocaine, not 4 kilos, not 400 kilos, 400 tons. That's the weight of about 200 cars. That's industrial scale drug trafficking with state protection, using the Honduran National Police to guarantee safe passage. And all of that, all of those years, all of that evidence, all of that rule of law was discarded with this social media post. Here's an analogy. Imagine spending 5 years building a house. Foundation, framing, electrical, plumbing, everything by the code. Final inspection passes. Then someone with a wrecking ball shows up and demolishes it in an afternoon because they don't like the color. That's what happened to the Hernandez prosecution. Except this isn't about aesthetics. It's about justice and the rule of law. Now contrast that with the boat strikes. No investigation, no charges, no trial, no evidence presented publicly. Just intelligence says they're traffickers, bomb them, and if anyone survives, bomb them again. It's the inverse of justice. When the powerful are your allies, they get pardons despite overwhelming evidence. When the powerless are your targets, they get executions without any evidence at all. This is what we call the Tucoque fallacy. Hypocrisy so profound it exposes the stated justification as false. You cannot simultaneously claim drug trafficking is so serious it justifies killing people without trial, and so minor that convicted kingpins deserve compassion. Unless, and this is key, drugs aren't actually what this is about. Segment 3, Blackmail and Vengeance. Let's talk about what happened this weekend in Honduras, because it reveals the true nature of U.S. policy in the region. As Hondurans went to vote, Trump threatened to cut off all U.S. funding if they didn't elect his preferred candidate. Not subtle diplomatic pressure, not private negotiations, public threats broadcast for maximum intimidation effect. Honduran analysts called it exactly what it is: blackmail and vengeance against all Hondurans. Think about the audacity of that for a moment. The United States, which claims to be promoting democracy, human rights, and rule of law, is explicitly threatening economic punishment if a sovereign nation doesn't vote the way we want. Here's an analogy. Imagine your neighbor saying, you can vote for whoever you want in your homeowners association election, but if you don't vote for my candidate, I'm canceling your kids' carpool and stopping shared lawn service. That's not respecting democratic choice. That's coercion. And it gets worse. The candidate Trump is threatening to cut aid over, the incumbent who defeated the National Party, Hernandez's party, the same party that ran Honduras as a narco state. So we're pardoning the convicted narco president while threatening the country that voted against his party. We're punishing Hondurans for trying to move past the corruption we enabled for decades. Because here's what Democracy Now! Guests made clear this morning. U.S. support for Hernandez wasn't a Trump anomaly. It spanned multiple administrations. Obama supported him. Trump supported him. They all knew. They all looked the other way because he was our guy. And now, after Hondurans dared to elect someone else, we're threatening collective punishment. This is what historian Dana Frank called vengeance. Not policy, vengeance. Segment 4, the cartel that isn't a cartel. On November 24th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio designated the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, as a foreign terrorist organization. This is the official justification for treating Venezuela as a terrorist harboring state requiring military action. Let's be precise about what this actually is. The Cartel de los Soles exists. There is documented evidence going back to the 1990s of Venezuelan military and political officials coordinating with FARC, facilitating drug trafficking and personally profiting from cocaine shipments. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned Venezuelan officials, including Diosdado Cabello, in 2018 for drug trafficking coordination. That's real. That's corruption. That's criminal activity that should be prosecuted. But, and this is critical, it is not a cartel in any traditional sense. According to Inside Crime, which studies Latin American organized crime and has no love for Maduro's government, what the U.S. calls the Cartel de los Soles is more accurately a corruption network. It's individual officials using their positions to facilitate and profit from drug trafficking. It's not an organized criminal enterprise with command structure, territory, and centralized operations like the Sinaloa cartel or CJNG. PBS reported, it is not a cartel per se. It is more about individual actors who are involved in the drug trade. Here's an analogy. If corrupt cops in a police department are taking bribes from drug dealers and providing protection, you have a corruption problem requiring internal affairs investigations, prosecutions, and institutional reform. You don't have a police officer cartel that requires military strikes on the police station. See the difference? Corruption networks require diplomatic pressure, international sanctions, law enforcement cooperation, extradition treaties, and accountability through courts. But terrorist cartels require military intervention and bombs. By mischaracterizing Venezuelan corruption as an organized terrorist cartel, the administration transforms a governance problem, which should be addressed through law, into a military threat requiring invasion. That's not semantic nitpicking. That's the difference between rule of law and rule of force. This is what we call false characterization. Taking something real and deliberately misrepresenting its nature to justify actions that wouldn't be warranted by the truth. And notice the pattern. Dozens of countries have corruption problems, but the one getting designated as harboring a terrorist cartel requiring military action just happens to be the socialist government with the world's largest oil reserves. That's not coincidence. That's the point. Segment 5, the Rubio factor. Now we need to address the person who made that terrorist cartel designation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio's brother-in-law, Orlando Sicilia, is a convicted cocaine trafficker. Not alleged, not suspected, convicted. He was arrested in 1987 as part of a $75 million cocaine operation and served over a decade in federal prison. When Rubio was a Florida state legislator, he wrote a letter recommending Cecilia for a real estate license without disclosing their family relationship. Cecilia appeared on stage at Rubio's political rallies throughout his career. Now, Am I saying Rubio is responsible for his brother-in-law's crimes? No, we don't choose our families. We're not accountable for our relatives' decisions. But I am saying this, the optics are devastating. The Secretary of State, who designated a corruption network as a terrorist organization, has a convicted cocaine trafficker in his immediate family. The administration pardoning a convicted cocaine trafficker has Marco Rubio running foreign policy. And that same administration is killing alleged traffickers without evidence or trial. Here's an analogy. Imagine a fire chief whose brother was convicted of arson, who's now pushing to demolish certain buildings for fire safety, while simultaneously pardoning another convicted arsonist and refusing to provide evidence that the buildings he wants demolished are actually fire hazards. At a minimum, you'd question whether fire safety is really what's driving his decisions. The pattern suggests that this isn't about drugs. It's about political and economic control, with drug war rhetoric deployed selectively based on who's useful and who isn't. Segment 6, the fentanyl deception. Let's talk about fentanyl, because this is where the administration's public justification completely diverges from reality. Trump has repeatedly invoked fentanyl to justify Caribbean operations. He's painted vivid pictures of boats stacked up with bags of white powder that's mostly fentanyl, threatening American families. That is false, not misleading, not exaggerated, false. The New York Times reported, and I quote directly, that Venezuela, quote, plays essentially no role in the production or smuggling of fentanyl, unquote. Here's how fentanyl actually works. Precursor chemicals are manufactured primarily in China and India. They're shipped to Mexico. Mexican cartels, primarily Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation, produce the finished product. Enters the United States overwhelmingly through legal ports of entry on the southern border, hidden in commercial trucks and passenger vehicles, often carried by U.S. citizens who are paid or coerced. Venezuelan doesn't manufacture fentanyl. It's not a significant transit point for fentanyl to the U.S. Military officials have privately acknowledged that the boats being struck carried cocaine, not fentanyl. Now let me be absolutely clear. Venezuela is a documented transit point for cocaine. Colombian cocaine flows through Venezuela to both the United States and Europe. That's real. That's documented by the UN and DEA. So here's the question. If there's a real cocaine trafficking issue that you could cite, why lie about fentanyl? Because fentanyl is killing over 100,000 Americans annually. It's the crisis dominating headlines. It's what parents fear when their teenagers go to parties. It generates visceral public fear and support. Saying we're bombing boats carrying cocaine to Europe doesn't generate the same emotional response as we're stopping fentanyl from killing your children. Here's an analogy. Imagine a mayor justifying a police crackdown on the west side of town by claiming there's a serial killer operating there, when the actual problem is car thefts and the serial killer is actually operating on the east side. The mayor is invoking the serial killer because it generates public support, even though the crackdown has nothing to do with stopping the actual serial killer. That's what's happening here. This is a textbook red herring fallacy, introducing an emotionally powerful but factually irrelevant claim to manipulate public opinion and divert attention from what's actually happening. The question isn't, is fentanyl killing Americans? Of course it is. The question is, do these operations address that crisis in any way? The answer is no. The administration knows it. That's why they're lying about it. Segment 7, kill them all. Now we need to talk about what may be the most disturbing aspect of this entire policy, the alleged order to kill survivors. The Washington Post reported, citing two sources with direct knowledge, that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave an order regarding the first Caribbean boat strike: kill everybody. According to the reporting, when two men survived the initial strike and were clinging to wreckage in the water, the mission commander ordered a second strike to comply with Hegseth's instructions. The Pentagon has called this completely false. Hegseth called it fake news. They dispute the account. But here's what's notable. Hegseth has not explicitly denied giving the order. He attacked the Washington Post. He's called it propaganda. He hasn't said, "I did not give that order." The Washington Post stands by its reporting, two sources with direct knowledge. So we have disputed reporting. I want to be transparent about that. But let's talk about what isn't disputed. 83 people are dead from these strikes. What isn't disputed? No evidence has been publicly presented that these specific individuals are trafficking drugs. What isn't disputed? None were captured, charged, or tried. What isn't disputed? Second strikes have occurred. This morning on Democracy Now!, national security reporter Spencer Ackerman, who's covered the war on terror for 2 decades, called this moral degeneracy and said the military is being turned into a criminal operation operating abroad with impunity. He raised something even more serious, the possibility of international war crimes investigations targeting Hegseth and others involved in these operations. Here's why that matters. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, which the United States helped write after World War II, require that wounded combatants receive medical care, even military combatants in declared wars. Finishing off wounded, unarmed people in the water isn't a military operation, it's execution. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated that intentional lethal force is only lawful as a last resort when individuals pose an imminent threat to life. Based on the information provided, none of the individuals on these boats appeared to pose such a threat. Senator Rand Paul, a Republican, called these extrajudicial killings comparable to what, quote, China does, what Iran does with drug dealers. They summarily execute people without presenting evidence to the public, unquote. Here's an analogy. Imagine police pursuing a suspected bank robber. They shoot him. He falls wounded. Then, as he's lying on the ground bleeding, they shoot him again to finish the job. That's not law enforcement. That's murder. Here's the crucial point that Ackerman raised. This isn't new. It's the extension of post-9/11 war on terror logic. After 9/11, the U.S. claimed the right to kill suspected terrorists anywhere in the world based on intelligence that was never verified publicly. Drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, signature strikes where we didn't even know who we were killing, just that their behavior pattern matched suspected militants. No charges, no trials, no habeas corpus, just intelligence says they're terrorists, kill them. And now that logic that we can kill people anywhere based on secret intelligence without legal process is being applied to drug trafficking. Think about where that leads. Today it's alleged traffickers in the Caribbean. Tomorrow it could be environmental activists labeled as eco-terrorists. Next year, political dissidents labeled domestic threats. Eventually, American citizens the executive branch decides don't deserve trials. You might think that would never happen here, but it already has. American citizens have been killed by drone strikes abroad, including Anwar al-Awlaki and his teenage son. The framework is being built right now. The precedents are being set, and if we don't push back, those powers won't stay limited to foreign policy. They never do. Segment 8. The war on terror comes to Latin America. Spencer Ackerman made another crucial point this morning. What we're seeing isn't departure from recent U.S. policy, it's a continuation of it. The war on terror created a legal and moral framework for extrajudicial killing, indefinite detention, and military operations without congressional authorization. Bush started it, Obama refined it and expanded it, Trump globalized it, and now it's being repurposed. The same logic that justified killing suspected al-Qaeda members in Yemen is now justifying killing suspected traffickers in the Caribbean. The same claims of secret intelligence too sensitive to share publicly. The same dismissal of international law as inconvenience. The same transformation of the president into judge, jury, and executioner. Here's an analogy. Remember when temporary emergency powers after 9/11 became permanent features of surveillance and security policy? The Patriot Act was supposed to be temporary. 2 decades later, it's still here, expanded and normalized. That's what's happening now. The war on terrorist framework, built for Afghanistan and Iraq, is being repackaged for Latin America. And just like before, it's being sold with lies. Before, it was WMDs in Iraq. Now it's fentanyl from Venezuela. Before, it was spreading democracy. Now it's fighting cartels. Before, it led to hundreds of thousands dead and entire regions destabilized. Now, we're watching history repeat itself in real time. And notice who pays the price. Never the architects of these policies. Always the people in countries we liberate. Always the civilians caught in the crossfire. Always the refugees fleeing the chaos we create, who we then vilify for seeking asylum at our borders. Democracy Now! Guest noted that U.S. policy toward Honduras, supporting corruption, militarizing security forces, and undermining democracy movements, directly created the poverty and violence driving migration. And then we criminalize the migrants. It's a closed loop of imperial violence and blame shifting. Segment 9. What is this really all about? So if this isn't primarily about drugs, and the evidence overwhelmingly shows it isn't, what's really driving this policy? I can't read minds. I can't prove motive with absolute certainty, but I can identify patterns and draw reasonable inferences. Let's look at the pattern. Oil and economics. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Despite calling Maduro a narco-terrorist dictator, the Trump administration has granted operating licenses to Chevron and Shell for Venezuelan oil fields. The New York Times reported Maduro offered to allocate Venezuelans' oil wealth to the U.S. to avoid strikes. We're negotiating business deals while preparing for invasion. Political alignment. Drugs flow into the U.S. from multiple Latin American countries, but the one facing boat strikes, airspace closure, and ground invasion is the socialist government. Meanwhile, right-wing Hernandez, who actually ran a narco state, gets pardoned. Election interference. The Hernandez pardon comes as Trump explicitly threatens Honduras with aid cuts if they don't elect his chosen candidate, the conservative candidate aligned with U.S. interests. Historical pattern. This isn't new. Guatemala, 1954. Chile, 1973. Nicaragua, 1980s. Panama, 1989. Iraq, 2003. Libya, 2011. Every time we're told it's about security threats, human rights, or weapons. Every time there are economic and political interests underneath. Every time we leave the country worse than we found it. Here's an analogy. If someone keeps telling you they're going to the gym, but every time they come back with shopping bags, eventually you realize that they're not actually going to the gym. The stated reason and the actual behavior don't match. The stated reason is drugs, but the behavior, pardoning right-wing traffickers, targeting socialist governments, negotiating oil deals, threatening elections, reveals different motives. When you have the world's largest oil reserves, ongoing oil negotiations with the narco-terrorist government, socialist government opposed by U.S. corporate interests, fentanyl rhetoric that's geographically false, pardons for right-wing traffickers, military escalation against left-wing governments, direct election interference to install favorable leaders. The most parsimonious explanation, the one requiring the fewest assumptions, is that geopolitical and economic interests, not genuine drug enforcement, are driving policy. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's pattern recognition, and the pattern is decades old. Segment 10, the fallacy catalog. Let's catalog every logical fallacy we've identified in this policy. False characterization, describing a corruption network as an organized terrorist cartel to justify military rather than diplomatic and legal solutions. Red herring, invoking fentanyl, which doesn't come from Venezuela, to generate emotional support for operations actually targeting cocaine transit, misdirecting public attention from the real drug sources. Tucoque, appeal to hypocrisy, claiming moral authority to execute alleged traffickers without evidence while pardoning convicted drug traffickers based on political utility, revealing the principle isn't about drugs. Appeal to secret knowledge, claiming intelligence justifies strikes while refusing to share that intelligence with Congress, courts, or international observers, making claims unfalsifiable and immune to scrutiny. Begging the question, these actions are legal because the president ordered them, is circular reasoning that doesn't address whether they comply with international or constitutional law. False dichotomy, framing the choice as bomb Venezuela or let drugs flood America, when effective interdiction happens at the Mexican border and Venezuela isn't the fentanyl source. Ad hominem, dismissing all criticism as fake news or terrorist sympathizing rather than addressing substance, evidence, legality, or consequences. Strawman, mischaracterizing objections to extrajudicial killing as being soft on drugs, when the real concern is about the rule of law and constitutional governance. Appeal to fear, using fentanyl crisis, real and devastating, to justify unrelated military actions, exploiting genuine public concern for political ends. Appeal to false authority, citing intelligence and military assessment without allowing verification, demanding trust without transparency. When you stack this many fallacies in defense of a single policy, you're not making an argument. You're constructing propaganda to manufacture consent for war. Segment 11, the precedent and the pattern. Here's why this matters, even if you don't care about Venezuela, Honduras, or Latin American politics. The precedent being established is this. The president can designate anyone, anywhere, as a threat based on intelligence never verified publicly. He can order their execution without charge, without trial, without evidence presented in any court. He can do this without congressional authorization. And if criticized, he can dismiss all objections as fake news or enemy propaganda. Here's an analogy. Imagine your local government announcing certain houses in your neighborhoods are suspected criminal enterprises, then bulldozing them without warrants, hearings, or evidence. And when the residents protest, calling them crime sympathizers. That's not rule of law, that's authoritarianism. Today it's Venezuelan boats. Tomorrow it could be environmental activism labeled as eco-terrorists for protesting pipelines or data centers in the desert. Next year, protesters labeled Antifa terrorists. Eventually, American citizens accused of crimes the executive branch decides are serious enough to bypass due process. That would never happen here, you might say, but Ackerman's reporting shows it already is. The mechanisms are in place. American citizens have been killed by drone strikes abroad without trial. The legal framework claiming the president has inherent authority to kill threats to national security without defining what that means or requiring proof is already established. And every time we accept it abroad, it becomes easier to apply at home. The surveillance state built for foreign terrorism got turned on American citizens. The militarized policing techniques developed for Iraq came home to Ferguson and Portland. The powers claimed for foreign wars always comes home. Democracy Now! Guests noted that Trump era and previous U.S. policies toward Honduras fostered the poverty, insecurity, and violence driving migration. When we militarize borders, criminalize asylum seekers, and separate families, all while claiming to care about law and order. You can't create chaos abroad and expect order at home. You can't export violence and expect peace. You can't dismantle rule of law in other countries and expect it to hold here. This is how republics die, not with dramatic coups, with incremental erosions justified by emergencies, until one day the constraints are gone and power is all that's left. Closing. Let me read you one more quote from this morning's Democracy Now! Years of evidence and legal work thrown out the window on social media. This is where we are. Justice decided by tweet. Wars decided without debate. People killed without trial. Elections threatened with blackmail. And all of it wrapped in the language of morality and security. I know some of you listening support Trump, and I'm not asking you to change your politics, but I am asking you to think about precedent. Do you want future presidents you might not support to have this power? To kill anyone, anywhere based on secret intelligence? to pardon convicted criminals for political reasons, to threaten foreign countries if their elections don't go our way, to bypass Congress entirely for military action. Because that's what's being normalized right now. Ask yourself, is this the foreign policy you want? One that pardons powerful allies while executing powerless suspects. One that mischaracterizes corruption as terrorism to justify war. One that invokes false threats to manipulate public emotion. One that's negotiating oil deals with governments it's preparing to invade. One that threatens entire populations with collective punishment for how they vote. Because what we're watching isn't strategy. It isn't coherent policy. It's contradictions held together by propaganda and justified through fallacious reasoning. And the victims aren't just people in other countries, though they matter too. The victims are constitutional principles, international law, the idea that evidence matters, the idea that no one is above the law, the idea that we're a nation of laws, not of men. U.S. regime change interventionism has a track record. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, Chile, Guatemala, Iran in 1953. It's reliably disastrous. It's always justified with lies. It creates chaos, refugees, and blowback. And it always makes things worse. We're watching it happen again in real time. The lies are being told. The justifications are being manufactured. The fallacies are being deployed. The history is repeating. The question is, will we recognize it before it's too late? Or will we look back in 10 years at the devastation and ask how we didn't see it coming? History is giving us the answer key. The test is whether we are paying attention. This has been Borderline Debates, Episode 4 on Maestro Morales. Demand evidence, question authority, defend rule of law. And remember, when they tell you this time it's different, check the history books. It never is. I'll see you next time. Borderline Debates is produced independently. This episode drew from Democracy Now! Reporting on December 1st, 2025, featuring historian Dana Frank, journalist Spencer Ackerman, and Honduran political analyst Rodolfo Pastor. Additional sources include The Washington Post, New York Times, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Reuters, BBC, Council on Foreign Relations, DEA reports, and federal court records. If you value intellectually honest analysis that connects the dots, share this episode. Leave a review. Support independent media. And in a world drowning in propaganda, never stop demanding receipts.